$50. That's what 52 degrees in the pouring rain, a trash bag of my clothes, and 18 years of being a disappointment was worth to my father. He threw a crumpled Ulysses S. Grant at my chest and locked the gate. Today, I'm the one changing the locks. Rain hammered against the massive wrought-iron gates of the Gallagher estate, mirroring the absolute coldness radiating from the man standing on the other side of the threshold. Arthur Gallagher, CEO of Gallagher Freight and Shipping, wasn't just a father. He was a corporate titan who viewed human beings entirely as ledger entries, either assets or liabilities. And on the exact day I turned 18, I officially became a liability. My birthday wasn't celebrated with a cake, balloons, or a gathering of family. It was marked by an ultimatum delivered across a sterile 30-foot mahogany dining table. To understand the sheer ruthlessness of what happened that night, you have to understand my mother, Claire. She was the heart of the Gallagher empire, the one who actually built the relationships with the dock workers, the truckers, and the warehouse foremen. When she passed away from ovarian cancer when I was 12, she left me something incredibly dangerous, a trust fund containing 15% of the company's voting shares, set to vest the second I became a legal adult. Arthur had been circling that trust like a vulture for 6 years. He was brokering a massive cutthroat merger with an overseas conglomerate, a deal that required absolute majority control. More importantly, his first order of business post-merger was to completely gut the worker pension fund, the very fund my mother had spent her last healthy years fighting to establish. "Sign the transfer, Nathaniel," Arthur had commanded that evening, sliding a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood, accompanied by a heavy gold pen. "Do this, and your tuition at Harvard is paid. Your allowance continues. You get to keep playing pretend in your little art studio." Looking at the man who hadn't shed a single tear at his own wife's funeral, something inside me finally snapped. I thought about the drivers who had attended my mother's wake, the men and women who had built his wealth on their broken backs. No, the word felt foreign on my tongue, but as soon as it left my lips, it anchored itself in the room. "Mom wanted those pensions protected. I'm not giving you the shares." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't turn red. He simply leaned back, his eyes narrowing into 2 dark, empty slits. He pressed a button on his desk, summoning his head of security, a hulking man named Briggs. "You think you have leverage because of a piece of paper?" Arthur's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it filled the massive room with a chilling echo. "My lawyers have already filed an injunction freezing the trust indefinitely under clauses of fiduciary incompetence. You won't see a dime of that stock until you're 50, if ever." He stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was inches from my face. He reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out a single crumpled $50 bill, and flicked it against my chest. It fluttered to the marble floor. "Take it," he sneered. "It's the exact cost of a bus ticket out of my county and a cheap meal. You're an adult now. You want to champion your mother's pathetic morals. Go do it on the street. You are no longer a Gallagher. Briggs, escort this trespasser off my property." 10 minutes later, I was standing on the shoulder of Route 9 in a torrential downpour, clutching a black trash bag containing 3 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, and my mother's silver locket. I had no phone. Arthur had confiscated it, claiming the family plan was a company asset. I had no car. I just had a damned $50 bill gripped so tightly in my fist that my knuckles ached. The first night was a brutal awakening to a world I had never truly seen from the leather seats of a chauffeured town car. I walked 7 miles in the freezing rain to a 24-hour truck stop on the edge of the city limits. I spent $12 on a lukewarm coffee and a dry sandwich, sitting in the corner booth, shivering violently as the reality of my situation crushed the breath out of my lungs. I was homeless. I was entirely alone. By sunrise, I knew I had to get as far away from Arthur's sphere of influence as possible. Gallagher Freight owned half the politicians and police chiefs in the county. If I stayed, I'd be harassed or worse, arrested for vagrancy just to teach me a lesson. I spent $28 on a Greyhound ticket headed 3 states over to a rusted-out industrial city called Camden. It was gritty, overlooked, and completely off Arthur Gallagher's radar. I arrived with $10 to my name. For the first 3 weeks, I slept inside a hollowed-out concrete pipe in an abandoned construction site, wrapping myself in discarded newspapers to stave off the biting autumn chill. I learned the agonizing hollow pain of true hunger. I learned how invisible you become when your clothes are stained with dirt and you haven't showered in days. Salvation came in the form of a woman named Maggie O'Connor. She owned a dilapidated, grease-stained diner near the freight yards. One morning, catching me digging through the dumpster behind her kitchen for discarded bread crusts, she didn't call the cops. Instead, she threw a heavy wet mop at my chest. "If you're gonna linger around my trash, you might as well make the floors shine," she barked, her voice thick with a heavy Irish brogue and cigarette smoke. "Minimum wage under the table. You get 1 hot meal a shift. Don't steal from me, or I'll break your fingers." It was the best offer I had ever received. For 2 agonizing years, that diner was my entire universe. I scrubbed floors until my hands bled, washed mountains of dishes, and eventually worked my way up to the grill. I rented a windowless, roach-infested room above a pawn shop for $200 a month. I saved every single penny that didn't go toward basic survival. But working at Maggie's diner gave me something far more valuable than a paycheck, an education in the massive, gaping flaws of the logistics industry. Every single day I watched Maggie and dozens of other small business owners in the neighborhood tear their hair out over delayed food deliveries, ruined produce, and exorbitant shipping fees. The big freight companies like my father's didn't care about the little guys. They prioritized massive corporate contracts, leaving independent restaurants and local hardware stores at the mercy of terrible routing and neglected supply chains. I saw the math in my head. I remembered the internal documents I used to read in my father's home office. There was a glaring inefficiency in the last-mile delivery sector for independent businesses. That's when I met Liam Davis. Liam was a brilliant, chronically underemployed software engineer who took a job waiting tables at Maggie's after his startup went bust. During our late-night shift, scrubbing down the grease traps, we started talking. I pitched him my idea, a streamlined, algorithm-driven logistics network specifically designed to pool the shipping needs of small, independent businesses, allowing them to split freight costs and guarantee next-day delivery. Liam was sold. We spent the next 8 months living on caffeine and sheer willpower. After our shifts at the diner, we would sit in my dingy apartment until dawn. Liam coded the routing algorithm on a cracked, second-hand laptop, while I hit the pavement, physically walking from storefront to storefront, pitching clear-path logistics to skeptical business owners. Our break came when Maggie agreed to let us manage her entire supply chain for a month. We slashed her shipping overhead by 40%. Word spread like wildfire through the Camden small business community. Within a year, ClearPath Logistics wasn't just an idea, it was a legitimate operation. We leased 2 used box trucks, hired free drivers, and moved our operations out of my apartment and into a cheap warehouse. By year 3, we were making millions in revenue. We were expanding across state lines, disrupting the local monopolies and carving out a massive, highly profitable niche. I finally felt like I had built something real, something that honored my mother's belief in supporting the working class. But I had underestimated the reach of the devil I shared DNA with. As ClearPath grew, it started popping up on industry radars. It didn't take long for the algorithms and aggressive expansion to catch the attention of the major players. One Tuesday morning, a sleek black envelope arrived at our warehouse via certified mail. Inside was a cease and desist order from the legal department of Gallagher Freight and Shipping, alongside a frivolous but financially crippling lawsuit alleging patent infringement on our routing software. Arthur had found me, My blood ran completely cold. I knew Arthur's tactics. He didn't file lawsuits to win them. He filed them to bleed smaller companies dry in legal fees until they suffocated and folded. I immediately called Liam into our makeshift office to strategize, but his desk was empty. His laptop was gone. The hard drives containing our backup source code were missing from the safe. Panic setting in, I dialed his number over and over. It went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until the next morning that the devastating truth was revealed. An industry blog published a breaking news article. Gallagher Freight acquires revolutionary last-mile routing tech. Attached to the article was a photo of Arthur Gallagher shaking hands with a newly appointed VP of Digital Innovation. It was Liam. My father hadn't just sued me to crush me, it was a distraction. Behind my back, Arthur had approached Liam, waving a 7-figure signing bonus and a corner office in front of a guy who had spent the last 3 years smelling like fryer grease. Liam had taken the money and handed over the proprietary code that we had built together, leaving me with a hollowed-out company and a mountain of impending legal debt. I sat in the middle of my empty warehouse, the familiar, crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. Arthur had won again. He had taken my home, my family, and now he had stolen the only thing I had ever built with my own 2 hands. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at the empty space where Liam's desk used to be, the despair slowly began to curdle into something else. Something hot, sharp and intensely focused. Liam was a brilliant coder, but he was incredibly lazy with his version control. I booted up my own terminal, my fingers flying across the keys, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in. I dug deep into the hidden directories of our local server. A grim, terrifying smile spread across my face. Liam had stolen the code, yes, but in his rush to cash Arthur's check, he had stolen version 2.4. He didn't know that for the past 3 weeks I had secretly contracted a freelance cryptographer to completely rewrite our back-end architecture into version 3.0, an impenetrable, blockchain-secured ledger system that made Liam's stolen code look like a rusty abacus. Arthur Gallagher had just paid millions of dollars for software that was already obsolete. He wanted a war? Fine, but I wasn't an 18-year-old kid shivering in the rain anymore. I was a Gallagher too, and I was about to show my father exactly what happens when you leave your blood on the street to learn how to fight. Silence in a warehouse is usually the sound of failure, but for me, it was the sound of a loaded gun clicking into place. The weeks following Liam's betrayal were a masterclass in psychological warfare and sleepless nights. Instead of publicly fighting the injunction or launching a desperate countersuit against Gallagher Freight and Shipping, I did the exact opposite. I shut ClearPath Logistics down. I boarded up the warehouse, laid off my 3 drivers with a heavy severance package paid from my own depleted savings, and let the industry think I had completely folded under my father's boot. Arthur's victory lap was heavily publicized. The trade magazines praised his forward-thinking acquisition of last-mile technology. He paraded Liam around at logistics expos like a prized show dog. But Arthur's fatal flaw had always been his absolute arrogance. He never bothered to look under the hood. Here is the fundamental truth about the code Liam stole. Version 2.4 was a delicate, highly specific algorithm designed solely for lightweight, localized deliveries. It was meant to route small box trucks through urban side streets to deliver restaurant supplies and hardware materials. It was essentially a brilliantly tuned sports car engine. Arthur, in his infinite greed, decided to rip that sports car engine out and forcefully bolt it into a massive, global fleet of 18-wheelers, cargo ships, and international freight trains. He fired his legacy routing team, gave Liam the keys to the kingdom, and integrated the stolen algorithm across his entire enterprise network, expecting a 30% reduction in fuel costs. It took exactly 14 days for the system to buckle. Working in absolute secrecy from the back room of Maggie's diner, I watched the disaster unfold in real time. I had teamed up with Harrison Wright, the deeply paranoid, brilliant cryptographer who had secretly built our version 3.0 architecture. Harrison had left a few harmless, undetectable breadcrumbs in the old code, not malware, just diagnostic pings that allowed us to passively monitor the system's stress levels. The cascading failures began on the West Coast. The algorithm, completely unable to comprehend the weight limits of interstate bridges or the docking schedules of international ports, started routing massive freight trucks down residential neighborhoods. It scheduled cargo ships to dock at ports that were already at full capacity. Supply chains gridlocked, perishable goods rotted in transit. High-priority medical supplies were lost in algorithmic limbo. Gallagher Freight began hemorrhaging clients. The overseas conglomerate Arthur had been courting for his mega-merger instantly pulled out, citing catastrophic operational instability. And Liam was drowning. I received a frantic blocked call at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Nathaniel, please." Liam's voice was shaking, high-pitched with pure panic. The swaggering entonies of the trucks are stuck in infinite routing loops. "Your dad is threatening to have me brought up on corporate espionage charges if I don't fix it. You have to tell me the missing variables. I know you held something back." I listened to the desperate breathing of the man who had sold my livelihood for a corner office. "You bought the house, Liam," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You get to deal with the termites." I hung up and smashed the burner phone with a hammer. With Arthur's company in a terrifying tailspin, I knew it was time to move to phase 2. I needed capital, and I needed a predator. I found one in Evelyn Croft. Evelyn was a ruthless, terrifyingly sharp hedge fund manager who had been brutally squeezed out of a lucrative shipping contract by Arthur 5 years prior. She hated my father almost as much as I did. I walked into her pristine, glass-walled office in Manhattan wearing a cheap suit, carrying a heavy binder containing the schematics of ClearPath version 3.0 and a detailed dossier on exactly why Gallagher Freight was currently collapsing. "He's bleeding out, Evelyn," I told her, sliding the binder across her desk. "His stock has dropped 40% in a month. His debt covenanters are about to trigger. He's going to need a massive cash injection to avoid Chapter 11, and the banks won't touch him because his logistics network is compromised." Evelyn flipped through the pages, her manicured fingernails tapping a predatory rhythm on the glass. "And what do you propose, Nathaniel?" "We form a shadow LLC, I said, leaning forward. "You provide the capital. We start quietly buying up Gallagher Freight's distressed corporate bonds for pennies on the dollar. We buy the debt. We become his largest creditor. When he inevitably defaults, we don't ask for cash. We demand equity, voting shares." Evelyn looked up, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "You want to steal your father's empire out from under him using the very crisis he paid for." "Nah, I don't want to steal it," I corrected her, the memory of my mother's devastated pension fund burning hot in my chest. "I want to repossess it." For the next 6 months, operating under the shell company Oak Haven Holdings, named after my mother's favorite botanical garden, Evelyn and I moved like ghosts through the financial markets. Every time Gallagher stock dipped, we bought. Every time a nervous bank wanted to offload Gallagher debt, Oak Haven was there, scooping it up for a fraction of its value. Arthur was completely oblivious. He was too busy fighting fires, firing executives, and fighting off lawsuits from enraged clients. He assumed Oak Haven was just another vulture fund looking to make a quick buck on a distressed asset. He had no idea he was systematically handing the keys of his kingdom back to the son he had thrown into the rain. 9 months. That's exactly how long it took for a 70-year-old, multi-billion-dollar logistics empire to crumble into absolute dust. The end didn't come with a massive explosion. It came with a pathetic whimper. Gallagher Freight missed a critical $90 million bond payment. The credit rating agencies downgraded them to junk status overnight. The board of directors, terrified of personal liability, forced Arthur to call an emergency shareholder meeting to vote on filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and liquidating the company's assets to pay off creditors. The meeting was held on a dreary Tuesday morning. The rain was lashing against the windows, a poetic callback to the night I was banished. I stood in the lobby of the Gallagher corporate tower, straightening my tie. Beside me stood Evelyn Croft, looking like an executioner in a tailored St. Laurent suit, and Harrison Wright, nervously clutching an encrypted tablet. I bypassed the reception desk and headed straight for the private elevator that led to the executive boardroom. "Excuse me, sir." A young security guard stepped in my path. "This floor is restricted for the board." Before I could speak, a massive hand clamped onto my shoulder. It was Briggs. The head of security had aged, his hair graying, but he still had the same thuggish sneer. "Well, well," Briggs grunted, tightening his grip. "The prodigal garbage returns. Mr. Gallagher gave me strict orders years ago. You aren't allowed within 50 feet of this building. Turn around before I break your jaw." I didn't flinch. I slowly reached into my inside pocket, pulled out a heavily stamped legal document, and pressed it flat against Briggs's chest. "This is an injunction from a federal bankruptcy judge," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet lobby. Oakhaven Holdings currently owns 64% of this company's senior debt. As the majority creditor, I legally own the walls of this building, the elevators, the chairs, and the desk you sit at. If you don't remove your hand from my shoulder in 3 seconds, Briggs, I will have you arrested for assaulting the majority owner of Gallagher Freight. Nah. Briggs looked at the document, his eyes widening in confusion and slow dawning horror. His hand dropped to his side. He stepped back, speechless. "That's what I thought," I murmured, stepping into the elevator. The doors to the boardroom swung open. It was the same 30-foot mahogany table, the same sterile, imposing atmosphere. Arthur sat at the head of the table, looking 10 years older, his face gaunt, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, sweaty desperation. The board members muttered nervously among themselves. The room fell dead silent as Evelyn, Harrison, and I walked in. Arthur stood up, his face flushing crimson. "What is this? How did you get past security? Get out of my building, Nathaniel." I ignored him entirely. I walked slowly down the length of the room, pulling out a chair at the opposite end of the table. The exact spot I had sat when I was 18. "Gentlemen," Evelyn announced, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I am Evelyn Croft, representing Oakhaven Holdings. We are the majority debt holders of Gallagher Freight, and I would like to formally introduce you to Oakhaven's CEO and your new primary stakeholder, Nathaniel Gallagher." The color completely drained from Arthur's face. He fell back into his leather chair, the breath knocked out of his lungs. "Oakhaven? No, that's impossible. You're a fry cook." "I was a fry cook," I corrected, opening my briefcase. "Then I built a logistics company. Then you stole my obsolete code, broke your own supply chain, and drove your company's valuation into the dirt. I just bought your life's work for pennies on the dollar, Arthur. You financed your own destruction." A board member named William spoke up, his voice trembling. "Mr. Gallagher, Nathaniel, are you here to liquidate us? If you force bankruptcy, thousands of people lose their jobs." "No, William," I said, sliding a thick stack of documents down the polished wood, accompanied by a heavy silver pen. "I'm here for a hostile takeover. Oakhaven will forgive the outstanding debt and inject $200 million in liquid capital into this company. In exchange, we demand the immediate resignation of the current CEO, Arthur Gallagher, and the relinquishing of all his remaining voting shares. Furthermore, ClearPath Logistics version 3.0 will immediately take over the global routing architecture, fixing the mess my father created." Arthur stared at the paperwork, his hands trembling violently. "You can't do this. I built this company. I am this company. You're a liability, I stated coldly, throwing his exact words back at him. Sign the transfer, Arthur. Do this and you get a quiet retirement. You get to keep playing pretend in your country club. Refuse and Oakhaven forces immediate liquidation. You will be dragged into federal court, investigated for corporate espionage regarding Liam Davis, and you will spend the rest of your life defending yourself in civil suits. You have 60 seconds. The room was suffocating. Every single board member turned their eyes to Arthur. The silence was absolute. Arthur looked at me, truly looking at me for the first time in his life. He didn't see a helpless kid anymore. He saw the monster he had forged in the cold rain. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen. He signed his name, his signature messy and broken. He stood up, defeated, a hollow shell of a titan. Without a word, he turned to walk out of the room. "Wait," I called out. Arthur paused, looking back over his shoulder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small glass frame. Inside the frame was a faded, crinkled, slightly damp $50 bill. I slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped exactly where he used to sit. "You dropped this," I said. "Keep it. You're going to need a bus ticket." Arthur stared at the framed bill, swallowed hard, and walked out the door. That afternoon, my first act as CEO was to fire Liam Davis and Briggs. My second act was to officially reinstate the worker pension fund, locking it behind an ironclad trust that could never be touched by executive greed again. My mother's legacy was finally safe. My third act was a bit more personal. I drove back down to Camden, pulling my new car up to Maggie O'Connor's grease-stained diner. I walked in, took off my suit jacket, rolled up my sleeves, and handed her an envelope containing the deed to the entire strip mall her diner sat in. I told her the rent was permanently zero. Then I grabbed a mop and helped her close up shop. Because you never forget the people who kept you warm when the rest of the world left you in the cold. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who hand you a mop when you're starving. If my journey from a discarded son with $50 to buying out a corrupt empire resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone fighting their own uphill battle against impossible odds. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of surviving, thriving, and claiming absolute justice.